All right, good evening, everybody. Really glad to see this many people here for this presentation. I appreciate y'all being here, and I think you're going to come away amazed with Dr. Hein's presentation. But this is still considered a workshop meeting, so we got to go through a few formalities as calling the meeting open, and then we're going to do a couple of things, and then I'll turn it over to him. So I'd like to call the January 15th, 2026 Town Workshop Meeting to order. And if Mr. Taylor could come give the invocation, if everyone would please stand. And right after the invocation, we're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance.
Dear kind and Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for your love. We certainly thank you for your patience, Lord. And Lord, we certainly thank you for your protection. Lord, we pray for every employee that we have. Keep a hedge of protection around them, Lord. We pray for every citizen we have, Lord. And like Lady behind me says, the people that come back and forth, Lord, we depend on them. Lord, just continue to be with us and give us guidance in everything that we, decisions that we make, Lord. And we thank you for Mr. Hines coming here tonight, Lord, and maybe take heed to things he say, Lord. And Lord, again, we just guide us and direct us in everything that we do. For we ask these things in Jesus' precious name. For a second, man.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And if I could ask everybody to silence their cell phones, please, that would be great. Last order of business, I need agenda adoption. Motion by Ms. Ellen, second by Chris to adopt tonight's agenda. All in favor? Any opposed? Adopted. Right there where Mike is standing, there is a QR code. Before you leave tonight, and there's also one out there on the door, if you would hit that QR code with your phone, let me read it real quick. It says, help shape the vision for a waterfront parcel. It says parcel on South Main Street. Take the survey below. If the town does indeed end up buying this property down on South Main Street, we'd like to hear your opinion on what you would like to see and what would like to be done with it. So if you would do that before you leave here tonight, that would be great. And without further messages, anybody got anything else over here on council to say? I'll introduce Mr. Chris Hein.
Thank you. I'm good. Yeah, sure.
And we're going to be able to do a question and answer session afterwards, okay?
All right, thank you very much to Mayor Bowden, to the Town Council for having us today. Really appreciate the opportunity. And of course, to Manager Tolbert for inviting me and Dr. Yana Giorgio, my colleague from the Water Institute, who is going to be co-presenting with me tonight. Now, I know I've had the chance to meet some of the folks in the room before. Maybe you've had a chance to hear some of my spiels about the geology of Chincoteague and its history, some of the work we've been doing out here. I am a coastal geologist, so generally I look at an island like this and I think, how did that form? How is that changing over time periods of thousands of years? And that's a lot what my talks have been around here. I've had the chance to present in the town or elsewhere on the shore. The business tonight is a little more serious than that, right? We're here to talk about the challenges faced by Chincoteague. One in particular, which is the erosion that's happening on the southern end. The goal here is I want to talk a little bit about the history of Chincoteague. I'll give you that geology, don't worry. Also want to tell you a little bit about how that geology of Chincoteague and Assateague and a bit of Wallops is influencing what's happening here. Right? And basically it's a geology problem at the end of the day. I have many geology problems in my world. Here, it's mostly the inlet. Right? That's the one. So have a chance to talk a little bit about that. And when about halfway through, I'm going to switch up and bring up Dr. Giorgio. And Giannis is going to talk a little bit about what we've been working on behalf of the town since about 2019, 2020. Done a modeling study that's helping to inform some of the approaches that could be used here. Right? Feel free to stop for questions. I know there'll also be a question and answer session at the end. But if I say something that just doesn't make any sense, please stop me. I'm happy to pause and answer that for you. All right, so getting into it, as we are. Nope, it's going to work. It's going to work. Nope. There we go. Told you. All right, so I'm not actually going to be talking so much about Chincoteague tonight as I am about Assateague and that spit hook right there that I know parts of it goes by the name Fishing Point, or we'll call it the Assateague Hook. This is an area that is of great geological interest to us, and I'll talk some about the history of it. But really, what happens on Chincoteague is due to that spit hook there, the dynamics around the inlet there. This is a place that, by the way, is of interest to me in my lab. If any of you, so I just want to make this plug early, if any of you happen to drive out there, take your trucks out, Jeeps out to the southern end of the hook, and you happen to see a bunch of poles, metal poles in the ground down there that went in maybe in September, October, with some tape on them and everything, some instruments, that's our fault. So if you see that, and you have any questions, my email address is on that, or my phone number. Or worst case, if you see one of those floating in the beach, do give me a call and let us know about that. But those are our instruments studying how this thing is changing today. So just put that plug in there early on that. All right, so first of all, I mentioned I was going to give some of this geological history. All right, this is Chincoteague and Assateague and Wallops Island today. didn't always look like that. If you go back in time around 3,000 years ago, Chincoteague looked like this, a little shoal, a sand shoal. Maybe it popped its head above water. A barrier island looked maybe like Assawoman or Metomkin Islands, getting washed over constantly by waves and tides. Right? Storms, taking sand on the front side, throwing it up and over the island onto the backside, a process that we call overwash. And over time, that drives that island landward, till you have what looks like Chincoteague Island and Wallops Island. At the time, maybe the area looks something more like that. Two barrier islands that don't look all that much different from Metomkin and Cedar right next to each other. Far up north, you have Chincoteague Island, and it's growing. It's going to keep growing to the south through time. This is what this area looked like around 2,200 years ago. This is what it looked like. Chincoteague Island was just a small spit of land. What we're sitting on right now, we would have been sitting in the ocean, offshore. Right? And over time, it grew. And it grew the same way that Wallops Island is growing today. Chincoteague Island is getting longer and longer, starts to grow down from the north. And as it does so, waves that come in during those big nor'easters, those waves hit Chincoteague and curve around and build sand up that way. Much the way you see if you ever look at a map, we'll go up to one quickly, right? Where Wallops Island has grown wider and wider and wider, the same thing happened with Chincoteague. It grew wider and wider. The whole thing grew out over time. It took about 1,500 years for this to happen. Over time, you start with that little narrow island, and it gets wider and wider as Chincoteague simultaneously grows to the south. Maybe starts to look something like that. So about 1,500 years, Chincoteague gets wider, Chincoteague gets longer. And Chincoteague only gets wider because Chincoteague gets longer. The point here is that from the beginning of Chincoteague's history, it's only here because of Chincoteague. It's only gone larger because of Chincoteague. And now, it's only experiencing erosion because of what's happening on Chincoteague. So we'll come back to that. Let's go back to history here. So sometime around 1800, a few hundred years ago, this is about what it looked like. Chincoteague's wide. You'll notice Mr. Whippies isn't there yet. It's starting to grow out, the island, but it's still, your picture is probably fully vegetated with trees. But this is around the time when there are some settlements, and in fact, this is the beach here and the lighthouse goes in, right? You don't build a lighthouse a few miles from the beach. Generally, you put it close to the water. And that's when this was the shoreline at that time. The lighthouse on Chincoteague goes in. We know this now, not from the geological record, not because we've gone around and taken a bunch of cores out here, but because you could actually see it in the historical record. Chincoteague Island coming down this little hook here. There's that shoreline where the lighthouse went on, and Chincoteague is starting to be developed. Through time, it grows out wider. Chincoteague Island gets wider and a little bit longer. You'll notice even there in this historical map from 1910, it's grown out, and you start to get that little isthmus that connects the southern hook. That's around 1910 that starts to grow, because about 1912, you get the first little bit of the hook start to form. Right? Notice here, though, where Chincoteague Inlet is, because that's one of the punchlines of this story. Chincoteague Inlet's actually back here. Right? Chincoteague Inlet, like Gargatha Inlet or Ocean City Inlet, is oriented with flow going east-west, the way most inlets are along this coast. So flow comes up here, kind of fills, and then heads up this way to fill and drain Chincoteague Bay. It's not north-south the way it is today. That doesn't occur until this hook grows. Hook grows down, and that reorients everything. So instead of flow coming in this way, it gets tilted, and now flow is running north-south and right up directed into Chincoteague Island. So the island, an old barrier island, is protected by Chincoteague, but now it's having water directed towards it. till eventually, right, it looks kind of like today as we walk through time. And we see this in the history as well. So this here is shorelines. Every one of these is a different color. We start in the greens. There's your 1912. If you could pick it out of that, you're better than me. But there's a 1912 shoreline right there. That's the original hook. And it grows wider this way. It grows, right? 1934, 1958, you have something that looks like that. Oh, in the 50s, it really starts to grow quite long, and you get that point called fishing point. They used to stick out there, right? When the hook was about twice as wide. And eventually, though, starting somewhere around the early 2000s, it erodes away. And so by here, we have these shorelines. This stops in 2017. Honestly, the 2026 shoreline would be basically almost on the floor. It's grown so much. But just at the very southern end. It's important. It's an important idea. We'll come back to that. Because this has continued to happen. This is a time-lapse image. This is a bunch of satellite images. It's going to start in 1984 and run to 2022, the last year that these images are available. That's what this area looked like this is from satellite. That is actually this area in 1984. And as we run this forward, you can watch this exact process. We had the wide spit out there, fishing point. Look at how small the inlet is. Meanwhile, we're growing further and further south, right? Until one day that erodes. And it continues to grow. That'll play back in a loop. I'll draw your attention to, first, what's happening at the south there, the growth of this spit. Right? So this is getting longer and longer. Let me explain how this is happening. It starts with sand largely being driven by northeast storms. Storms do most of the work. Right? A quiet water day, you don't get small waves, you're not moving a lot of sand. And just think about yourself as a sand grain in the waves. You go out there on a quiet day and you can paddle around a bit, maybe even take one of those little paddle boards out and you're fine, right? Even in the ocean. On a storm, that wave picks you up, slams you down on the beach, and throws you around a little bit further, right? Dislocates your elbow. I'm not talking from experience. So that's what's happening here. During these storms, waves are driving sand, picking it up grain by grain, and driving along this shore. Northeast storms, waves, winds from the northeast, pushing everything to the south along here and allowing this area to grow out. That sand basically hits this hook and stops and gets deposited, where each one of these ridges is basically one of the years in history. There's a new one forming every year. It's an enormous volume of sand in that. There is more sand in this area plus that part of Chincoteague than there is in almost all the other barrier islands south of here to the mouth of the bay. Right? It's an enormous volume of sand. Right? But if that sand is staying here, if it's coming down, working its way all the way from Delaware and staying here, that means it's not getting any further. It's not feeding wallops. You might have noticed the rocks I've put there because of that. It's not feeding the islands to the south, and it's not feeding this part. Sand is not coming around and feeding that. And so let's look at this one more time. Oh, go back to it. Hang on. All right, we're going to play this again, except this time, I want you to pay attention to what's going on that spit hook. As this grows, it gets to a certain point where all your sand is getting trapped here and it just can't get around anymore. You're basically starving that hook right there. You're starving with the old fishing point. Sand can't make it, the point erodes. Eventually that sand gets pushed up in this direction. If you've been out in a boat, you may have gotten stuck there. Again, not speaking from experience. But it's also started to fill some of the channels up here, particularly in this area. One other thing I'll draw your attention to as this plays one last time is once that opens up, watch that marsh island right there. Opens up there, the inlet's twice as wide. Watch what happens to that island. Yeah, it goes away. Let's talk a little bit more about why. So this, by the way, you see I'm using a lot of examples. Patrick's probably here. So, yep, Patrick, thank you very much. Patrick Hendrickson provided a lot of the imagery, the aerial imagery I'm using today. This, I think, is just a fantastic example of it. 2 photos he took from the same angle, more or less, from November of 2004. You see how long that spit end was here, fishing point was, right? This goes about halfway out into the inlet, which means the inlet's about half its size at that point, as compared with 2011. Yeah. Bam, it's gone. Gets eroded away. That sand gets pushed up into the inlet and creates this broad shoal. Meanwhile, don't worry, the hook is still growing to the south, right? It's doing fine, but it's so far south that the sand just can't make it all the way back up and feed that spit. And, this is the most recent imagery we have from Google Earth. This is 2024, which also shows, look, there's a little hook there. Not quite the same as what it used to be. But this has grown quite a bit further south. In fact, there's maybe another new fishing point forming out there. Unfortunately, it's too far away from the inlet to really do much good that hook once did. So take a look at this here. This is in December of 1994. There you had that large fishing point there. Notice how wide the inlet is. You got 2 channels there. There's bar of sand sitting offshore of Wallops Island. And compare that to 2024. If we zoom in here a little bit, just to southern Chincoteague, and that marsh island that I pointed out before, we'll zoom in. Here it is in 94. So I want to point out, there's the marsh island at its end. There is the kind of the marsh at the southern end of Chincoteague, and there's the marsh that is at the right near the harbor there, right? So right just beyond the end of the riprap there is kind of that, looks like old road or something, broken up concrete holding up the edge there, right? Those arrows are not going to change position. I am going to flip through a few years here. That's 94. That's 2013. That's 2024. I'll do that again. The arrows are basically touching the land in this first one. Right? All right. That image, it is grainier. It's from a different source, but that's from last week. Just pointing to those same areas. You'll notice it's still eroding. And this is actually one I took on our way out the inlet on Monday of that same area, where this is that riprap that you have up here, and then this is the marsh that's set, that used to be equal to it, that's set pretty far back. And this is from, again, a nice aerial of those same areas. And you can see that it's eroding, right? It's not, look, you did not need a geologist to come from Williamsburg to come here and tell you that this area is eroding. You guys see it all the time you go out there, right? You don't need me to say that. The things I'm looking at here are the large sandbar that's formed there, almost like a little barrier island that's forming out there as this thing is eroding. It's probably sand and shell, is my guess, even from afar, right? That's always evidence that you have erosion of these marsh edges. It's high energy. What moves sand? I already told you. What moves shells? I told you. It's big waves. So all of a sudden, you got waves coming in there doing that. You don't really have that same thing over here. You don't have, there's some sand, but it's not quite as coarse. It's not quite as thick of a deposit there. Maybe currents are playing more of a role there as well. So that's kind of some of the background. The big picture here is what's happening down here at the spit hook is influencing the energy that's coming in from the ocean. On a day where you have a good south swell and you've got those waves coming in here, and this inlet is now twice as wide, you got waves coming in, bam, right there, directly into southern Chincoteague, right into that marsh island, chewing them up and eroding them. It's not the fault of Chincoteague. Has nothing to do with the harbor. It's natural growth of a totally natural system here. Just typical barrier dynamics that this thing is growing, starving sand to the fishing point part of the hook, allowing the inlet to open up. There are, for reference, few places on the Earth's surface more dynamic than the coast. And of those places, Tidal inlets are the most dynamic. And of tidal inlets that are dynamic and coasts that are dynamic, there's probably almost none more dynamic than here in Virginia. The Virginia Barrier Islands, which experience one of the fastest rates of sea level rise, the second fastest in the country, right here. You got it. Congratulations. It has, it is sand starved. The islands to the south of here don't have any sand because this has taken it naturally. This inlet, because of these dynamics, because you have waves and winds coming down from the north, you have south swell, you have, again, natural growth of northern Wallops Island. It's a really dynamic system, and this is just over decades. You don't have to go back thousands of years. We can see it, but we can also go a bit further. And so the rest of the talk here, we're going to introduce to you what we call the Chincoteague Inlet model, the SIMS model, as we refer to it. I'm going to bring up Dr. Giorgio at this point. It's pretty small here. We can send it to you. You can come up later, grab that QR code. We wrote a paper about this. It's a scientific paper more for our colleagues. We're here to tell you what's in it today and tell you about how we use something that starts with just a bathymetric map, a very high resolution bathymetric map to understand and quantify the changes that you're seeing here. So, Giannis, your turn. I could give it to you or not? You want to use this?
I can use that.
Okay.
Just in case you have to jump in and save me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me well? Well, I must admit, I've known Chris for, 21 years now? That's going to be tough to top. So I think, that was the best fun we had tonight, and I'm going to try to keep up the pace. But, I have the card stacked against me. Did we not? Do we have the wrong talk open?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I think we might. It's okay. Maybe I forgot to block the slide. So, all right. My name is Giannis Georgiou, and like I said, I've been working with Chris now for 21 years. And a few years ago, I had the privilege of coming up here and do some field work with him, the toughest I've done, in my career. My background is in hydraulics, and one of the things that I do for the research and what I want to show you here today is the information that we take from the field, especially information from field scientists like coastal geologists, and then we put that information into a model, a computer model, and then we try to make sure that model reproduces reality first. So we try to put in good information and good assumptions into that model, and then we try to simulate some conditions to try to solve problems that you can't really solve by waiting nature to show you that, we could ask the question, well, how long would it take for us to lose another 10 meters or, 20 feet of shoreline? And, you could wait a decade or you could wait a year to see that. In some cases, you can't afford to wait that long or you don't want to. And, that's where you try to use some additional computational science, as we call it, and models to tell you that, hey, we can't wait that long. Tell us what drives that erosion, or what are the consequences, or what are the biggest drivers, so then we can try to do something before we get to that point. So as Chris said, we're not going to bore you with details about this today, but this is a model that is commonly used by coastal engineers and coastal scientists to help find out what exactly drives problems along the coast, and how can we go about solving, reducing the problems, reducing the erosion. One good thing about computer models is that once you build them and you've sort of test them against real live observations, and you have some faith in them. Remember, models are not perfect, just like people are not perfect. Sometimes our science is not perfect, and we always like to collect more data to better understand the problems. They are really good for something, that serves the public very well, and science too, is that you can do hypothetical tests in models. You can say, hey, what happens if I put something here? What happens if without physically building that project, going through all the expenditures of getting permits and doing all that expenditure. So anyway, But I emphasize that they're not perfect, right? They can give you a lot of information, and then, us as scientists use that information as best we can to see what happened. So I'm going to go through this. All right. So one of the information, as Chris said, that goes into a model is what does the landscape look like? The bathymetry, how deep is the water? Where do we have marsh? Where do we have big ridges and trees and all that? So the whole landscape goes into the model. What you see on the screen is really some of the most recent surveys. Like we go in websites run by the federal government where you have bathymetry, the Army Corps of Engineers. First, we download that information as best we can, trying to save the project money. But then sometimes you don't have good data or good information to put in the models in areas that matter. In this case, this inlet, the Chincoteague Inlet, and the areas that have changed so rapidly, as Chris mentioned before. Well, when something changes so rapidly along the coast, then whatever information you have that is a year old or 2 years old is probably outdated. So you have to go and collect new data to make sure that you are representing the modern system, the real system, as best you can. And that's what we did with some other colleagues. And then we go and look at, how does the water move in this area? What do the waves look like? What do the tides do, right? And again, the first stop is federal websites or state websites that may have observations like tide gauges and wind gauges and things like that, or wave gauges. And then again, depending on the problem, if that information isn't available or it doesn't span the area of interest, we put instruments in the water to collect more currents and more waves, which is exactly what we did here. All that went in to give us enough confidence that this tool that we built is able to represent reality, at least in the area of interest, with reasonable accuracy. And we have numbers that we run to make sure, are we 90% accurate, are we 95% accurate, but some reasonable accuracy before we do any testing beyond that. So, and I'm going to go straight to some results. One of the things we did here is to go back in time a little bit to where we had the best available information from aerial photography or even older bathymetric maps from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and then try to rebuild the speed back from the 80s and 90s. Remember the hook, as Chris showed it earlier today? Well, first, we built the model for the modern system, which is what you see on the right. Here it is, not as it is today. As Chris showed, this had changed a little bit. This is now about 2020, I think, is what we have here. So it is a few years old already. But then we went back in time and we told the model, hey, my spit looks different or my hook looks different. And then we also built it like it was in the 80s. And so then we run the model for the same conditions. Remember, in the model we put wind, we put tides at the open boundary. We have NDBC, NOAA buoy, wave buoys out there. So when we give that information to the model, then it tells us what happens in the area that you see in colors. So when the color is red here, it means that the current is moving faster, 3 feet per second, maybe a little bit faster. And, when close to blue, then the current is moving really slow. And as Chris showed before, when the tide comes in, right, part of the tide comes through the inlet here, as we saw. The harbor is right here. The part that's eroding pretty fast is right here, just south of the harbor. And part of the water goes around. As Chris said earlier today, this is the old inlet. This is where the old Chincoteague Inlet used to be when Assateague Island wasn't here, when it was all the way up here, as Chris said before. And then we see the same over here. Now, the currents, it's hard to see the difference between these two. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that they are so different where we can pick, because the waves is what matters. But even in this figure, you can see that the currents in the flood shoal over here between the northern part of Wallops and just in front of the harbor here to the south, they're different, right? You can pick a few differences, but it's the next slide that matters. And the next slide is perhaps the most important one. Now, we know what drives waves, right? wind. Wind blows over water, and then you start to get little ripples over the water, and then wind continues, and then those ripples grow larger and larger. But if you put water in a bucket or in a bowl and you blow a lot of air over it, right, you can only get so much waves, right? You can't get a 1 foot wave in a bucket of water. But you can get 1 foot wave if you put a tank, the size of this stage up here, and blow wind over that. So the distance over which wind blows matters, and then the depth of the water over that distance also matters, and then the size of the wave that's coming into that system also matters. So when you have a lot of exposure, you could get waves to be larger, even if the wind doesn't change, right? And that's the message that I want to point to today. So coming back to this image, remember the one on the left is from the 1980s, where the hook was much larger, longer, I should say, not larger, and the inlet was smaller. And then this is the more recent part. And these are even waves. If you look at the waves, the arrows here tell us the direction that the waves are going. And then the color we see here tells us how big the waves are. So when you see red, the waves are larger. Here they are offshore, as we know and expect. Waves are larger. And then as they come into here, you start to see yellow colors. They're about 3 feet. And as they come through the inlet, they're, this cyan color, this is now about 2.5 feet, maybe 2 feet. And then as they come all the way up here, they're getting smaller and smaller. But notice the difference between this image over here and this image over here. What do you see? There's more color over here, right? Not only there's more color, but it's more widespread. And that tells us that there are more waves. Remember, the waves out here offshore for these two tests, they're identical. There's no difference. The wind is the same. The offshore waves are the same. The direction of those waves is the same. But then just by changing the two inlets, the size of the two inlets, going back 30 years and today, we see this difference. So that comes back to some of Chris's points that, yes, the area that is eroding the fastest today is exposed to more wave energy. Then we told the model that, hey, what happens if we have waves from the south, right? Instead of waiting for the waves coming from the east to refract and swing around the inlet and then come up north, what if they're coming straight? Well, we see the same story. In fact, you could argue that it's a little bit worse when the waves are coming from the south because they don't have to go around the hook, where they're going to get a little bit smaller before they come into the bay here, Tom's Cove, and in front of the harbor. And it's obvious, again, I don't have to convince you, right? You can see that we have more color over here. We have bigger arrows, which tell us that we have, larger waves. So we're going to go back and we're going to look at a line that tells us how big the waves are from here to here. Chris avoided showing plots, and I'm going to bring you back to school for a second here. So again, pointing out that the green line here is the more recent conditions, and then the brown line is from the 1980s. And again, it's not just the colors that we shown before. Here are the same information. We see that always the green line is above the brown line. That means that for the entirety of that line that I showed before, we have higher waves. And then when we calculate what that wave is to energy, then we see the same thing. And in particular, I didn't put arrows here, but you see this big hump right here? You see that? Well, that is exactly where this area is. And if I go back on the plots before, just to confirm that is right here. You see this area right here? You see how there's much higher colors over here? Now, if you remember when Chris showed these images, the before and after, this island right here, remember, it started to erode very quickly. And as that hook was opening up, the inlet was opening up because the hook was getting reoriented. And that's exactly why, right? Even though it was getting hit with some waves before, it was so much larger 20-some years later. All right, I'm going to go past this now, and I'm going to bring us back to images. So again, this is the same image that Chris showed earlier. This is from 94, and the distance over wind blows we call fetch. And then I just did some quick calculations here. I'm going to go to the next slide. So we see that, if you're sitting out here, these are the areas that we're showing before that were eroding very rapidly. You can see here that there isn't much fetch. So it doesn't matter if you have high winds, right? The waves can only grow so much because, there's obstacles. There are shoals in the way, smaller channels. Even the distance here to this shoal back then was about a mile. And then to the old hook, which is down here, the largest fetch is about 1.5 miles. And if you look at the exposure of the area to larger swell or waves from the ocean, you see that it's pretty small. It's not very wide. And that means that most of the waves that were hitting this area of the coast back then were kind of limited to whatever waves the wind could grow, by blowing over the flood delta. And they were mostly what we call locally generated waves. Not much swell was making it in. Again, that's the point, right? And swell waves are longer. For being out there on boats, you ride them a little bit slower than the shorter waves that are wind generated, especially if you go up in Chincoteague Bay, right? And you have a little bit of a gusty wind and you're on a flat boat, you get that, right? So we don't, you're getting more of that and less of the swell. Now, fast forward to today, and maybe not today, a couple of years ago, that's the image we have. Now, I kept on the map here the trace of the 94 shoreline, and you can see that, right? You see the island over here, and you see the original 94 coastline. And I keep the sign there. So if we do the same analysis here, just simply drawing lines on a map and measuring what they are, we see that we have fetches now that are about 1 mile, even to this tiny little shoal that's much smaller today than it was 20, 30 years ago, about 1 mile. And over here to Wallops, we're now well over 1 mile, about 1.5 miles. And then we see that now we have not only a much wider opening, but the fetch out to swell waves is, at least 2.5 miles, if not more. I mean, I could draw this line, it could go 5 miles more or 10 miles more, right? So, and the message here is that now you see this triangle is much wider, right? Because we have a much wider inlet, more swell energy comes in. We can generate swell waves much easier for the same winds, and then they travel longer and they remain larger and they get closer to shore. And what drives shoreline erosion, as Chris mentioned, is really how those waves transform. They become smaller, they break, and that's exactly what they do. They have energy because they travel through the water, and then when they get to an obstacle, they break, they shoal, and all they're doing is that they're generating much larger forces today that cause the erosion that we see. Chris, you want to come up and close us up?
Let's get that going. So we've left up here obviously our contact information and whatnot. This is another link to that paper. If you're interested, just use your camera. Should bring you to the website. It's free. A lot of scientific literature, a lot of science isn't. We made sure that we use our resources to ensure this one's open for you guys. I mean, our scientific colleagues can access that. We don't care about them. This is for you guys. But we hope this presentation actually showed some of what we show in that. And that talks about building the model and some of its uses. This, we hope, gives some of the background here, explains why we're seeing what you all observe down there, what this threat is. It's not the only threat to Chincoteague. Right? I mean, the same northeast swells, the same northeast winds bring water up to the causeway, the road heading down to the harbor. We all know if you tried to travel it, when there's a high tide and a northeast wind, you know that it gets a little wet down there. So there's a number of other physical threats from rising water levels, again, very high rates of sea level rise here relative to other places, even on the East Coast, and that changing inlet. So we hope that gave you some example of the why. That's kind of our job as scientists. We're not here to say what you should do. That's for your town council. We're here to hopefully give some of the science that can help support that decision-making process, and as possible, use this model to do so, to help guide that. It's not a very fine resolution engineering model. Hopefully, there'll be the opportunity for the Army Corps to be able to support some of that and do that work to help guide engineering designs to try to stabilize that shoreline, slow that erosion. Because, if you haven't seen it here today, I don't know, I give up, but the Chincoteague Inlet is constantly changing. Chincoteague Island is constantly changing. That hook's going to continue to grow. We tested in the model whether we think the isthmus is going to breach. And you go back and you can find, you've probably seen it yourselves, times where that thing has breached. I've stood out there by accident with a class of students. We thought we were going to go down to the hook. And instead, we stood there and watched water flow from the ocean into Tom's Cove. And there was a river we couldn't cross. Another failed field trip that I've run. It's great. But you know what? It didn't open up. There wasn't some big inlet there. It closed. It's happened over and over. And the modeling says it's probably going to happen like that again. Instead, it's going to be what happens at that hook. What happens at northern Wallops. In those natural areas, the sand is moving across that inlet. That's going to shape what happens on this shore. And for now, the answer is, at least, you see how it changes over decades. For now, the answer is a lot of wave energy coming through that inlet. And that shoreline is at risk. Not just at risk, is experiencing that wave energy and eroding as a result. And, some way of hardening it is a solution for consideration. So, there's our information. I know there's microphones up here. I'm sure there's going to be questions, and I'm happy, Giannis probably too, but I'm happy to answer them.
I'm happy to.
Raise your hand if you got questions. I'll bring the mic around. Let's get Rich first.
Thank you. So to touch on what you just said there at the end, so when that breach happens multiple times throughout the year,
Yeah.
you expect that to continue. So it's temporary. The storm comes in, blows that area out, and then it's depositing sand back along there. Is that what your models show?
That is. And what do they say in investing? Past returns or something, past success does not guarantee future returns. I will not stand up here and say that will never, ever breach because we can't know the future. I'm a geologist. I look at the past. But the way we do our science is we let the past inform how we understand the modern, the present. And the way that shows all evidences from the model as well, that it is unlikely to stay open. Tom's Cove is flat. What's going to happen is that isthmus is going to continue to, as it's done, rapidly migrate landward, hence why it's not worth having a parking lot over there. That whole thing is going to...
Shut your mouth.
Okay, sorry, that's a different topic. Parking lot's great, yeah. Take that... Oh, I'm sorry, I got to clean off my shoe. I stepped in it there.
We don't like to talk about parking lots.
Something from the horses. That isthmus migrating landward or to the west has happened. I mean, you can look at those old diagrams. I can show you how much that thing has moved. 3 times its current width it's moved in the last 100 years. It'll continue to do that. It hasn't yet breached and stayed open. It's got a shallow, fairly unerodable substrate back there. The sediment back there is not. It's unlikely to breach entirely. Plus, you also have this massive inlet at the south. That flows, it's weird. It goes north-south compared to the others, but it's a deep inlet. If you're a molecule of water and you're coming past Chincoteague and heading out, it's a heck of a lot easier just to go out that big hole than try to force a new one and make a hard left turn and head out through there. So that's the reason those are the reasons we think it won't happen. But that's what the history tells us. It's been 100 years it's been there. I think it's got more.
So, assuming that Fishing Point continues to erode to the east, Wallops, the northern end of Wallops, is also growing eastward at the same rate. So will that width of the inlet stay pretty stable, or is that easy or not easy to predict?
So watch us disagree up here, maybe. That'd be fun. Live disagreement. So my first take would be that if you look at Wallops, what's happening is it is growing, but now most sand transport is going around that point there of northern Wallops and forming those little spits, those little, we call them flying spits, that form kind of inside the inlet there. Where it's not actively growing any wider. There's a big slug of sand. When the inlet opened up, there was a big slug of sand that I showed in an early slide. I go back there, that was sitting, it was almost like two channels, and that slug of sand moved on shore and allowed Wallops to grow. The sand that is reaching Wallops and heads to the north along Wallops tends to keep going up into the inlet and is kind of filling some of those channels. So it doesn't show evidence that it's still narrowing there. And at some point, you still have a lot. Chincoteague Bay is big. The tidal range is not huge, but it's still a large bay, so there's a lot of water. We call it the tidal prism, the volume of water that's got to get in there during the flooding tide and back out during the ebbing. That's going to maintain a channel of a certain width and depth, cross-sectional area.
I'll add a couple of points. To the first question before, one of the reasons that Tom's Cove breaches close is because they're not, first of all, they're not big enough. They're not capturing the tidal prism, which is the water that flows into and out of the bay. And because there's always sand moving from north to south on Assateague, and eventually it shuts them down. And back to your question now to add, as Chris said, his last couple of sentences was that the Chincoteague Bay, the whole area from Ocean City Inlet all the way to the entrance to the inlet here by Fishing Point, is very big. The tidal prism is very big, and inlets, have a few jobs, but one of their main job, right, as the tide moves in and out, is to clear the sand that ends up there from waves. So an inlet will close if the currents are not fast enough to move the sand that the waves put in the inlet, right? And so in a simple world, because this world is not very simple, it's very dynamic, it's very complicated. But in a simple world where you have a straight coastline and an inlet that is 90 degrees to that coastline, waves moving across the inlet will put sand in the inlet, then the tides are going to put it out in the ebb delta or put it in the flood delta, and all they want to do is clear the inlet, right? But they do that if they have a lot of water to exchange with each tide, right? That's what keeps the inlet's currents fast. Those who drive boats through inlets know some inlets are tricky, but water goes in and out, and that's its one job that inlets do. So to answer your question, because I haven't answered it yet, there is a possibility where the growth of Wallops Island to the east, the progradation, and Chris is going to point there, and the continued growth of Fishing Point to the south, as long as there's room between those two islands, the Hook and Wallops, the water is going to go through there. And as long as the speed of the water can clear that channel, they're never going to come together, right? So I don't want to make any more promises beyond that. But the only reality for a Tom's Cove breach to remain open is if water cannot clear, if water can clear, make it deeper, and make it capture some of that tidal exchange between the bay. And Chris and I had an old colleague who passed away a few years ago. He always used to say, water doesn't care, right? And really, my answer is that water doesn't care. If it's more difficult, just like in rivers switch channels all the time in deltas, right? Why? Well, they build land over here, they build a delta, and then when it becomes it's too difficult to keep building land, right? They don't want to do the hard work. The rivers say that, you know what, I'm done with this channel. Now I'm going to shift over here. So in a similar way, we see that here. Water is going to go around the Hook and in between Wallops and the Hook until it's too difficult for it to do that. And then it's going to find another way, right? So I want to stop there.
Using your model, have you projected into the future specific outcomes visually, and how far into the future have you projected?
That's a very good question. We try to do that up to the point that we don't feel comfortable. And the reason I say that is not because we don't like to do hard things, because that's what I do. I also spend a lot of time in the field, and I know what happens in the field. And even I sometimes say that, yeah, no, this is not right, right? So I do have a gut feeling. So we go into the future as much as we think that our predictions make sense, because sometimes, in a fast changing system and in a complicated setting such as this one, you have to be careful. Yeah, we can run the model and it's going to tell us, hey, this is going to happen. But unless we can sort of narrow down that or run a bunch of scenarios or do something that would give us more confidence that the result is most accurate or it's a reasonable representation of reality, I usually don't even publish that stuff, right? So because a model shows you a result, it doesn't mean that it's correct. A lot of assumptions go into models. So we've gone forward a few years. We've gone forward. We often, in the work that I do, and beyond this study as well, we go forward maybe 10 or 20 years or something like that, or we take reasonable output from the model and make some reasonable projections. But there's so many unknowns the farther you go in the future that are going to influence the outcome. Like, we need to make an assumption of what the weather is going to be for the next 30 years. We need to make an assumption on what sea level is going to be. Well, what if it ends up being a little bit different than what we think it's going to be now, right? Then we have to come back and run the model again. So we've done a little bit of that. We can probably do more if needed to support the next steps or provide the right information to do a more focused study on what is the immediate need and how to address it. But what we have tell us that, the spit's going to continue to grow, and there's going to be some battle between where the tidal flow is going to go. But the two channels now are sufficiently large where we're not going to see those large changes in the next 10 years. But erosion will continue for the reasons we described today.
Thanks. This is really informative. I've always had a question and I wondered, and I don't know if your model would show it or you have the input from your model, but everybody to the north of us, Ocean City North up through Delaware, they all do beach remediation and pump sand back onto the beach. And I assume that everything kind of flows north to south. So does that have any effect on what we see here?
So we actually did the calculations on some of that to look at the volumes of nourishment that they've done on Ocean City, just north of the inlet, and compared that. And it's I forget the exact numbers, it's been a few years, but it's in the single digits of % of the volume of sand that gets trapped here every year. So it's, if you look at it, you do it out over, decades, it's not nothing. I don't want to say it's not significant. It's a word we use very carefully in science. It is something, but you wouldn't notice if they stopped.
Thank you so much for your presentation, for taking your time, and I learned so much. And the thing that's really striking me is that analysis of the increased wave energy that's not just hitting the southern tip of our island, it's also hitting the eastern side. And since I'm a typical American and I'm interested in my own backyard, I'm feeling really nervous about the area near our Memorial Park. We had significant flooding there this spring, and lots of salt water coming up into our yards and killing plants. Again, something that happens personally to bother me. It's not that picture I'm talking about. It was the one where you had the arrows and it said 2.5 miles of wave energy versus...
It's right after this, I think.
Those ones.
Go back one so we don't see the triangle.
So, and I saw exposure to swell waves and that you're pointing it just at the southern end, but if you go just a little bit to the right, you're coming, and now you go north, you're getting to our park, our
Yeah, it's
Memorial
up around,
Park.
Yeah, it's up around there on the eastern shore of the southeast corner of the developed area.
So should we be very worried about this increased wave energy coming at us?
So you mentioned flooding and then wave energy. Those are two slightly different things. You can have both, but is a problem, so understanding correctly, more flooding or is it waves? So flooding from a high tide and wind?
It was a storm surge.
Okay.
I wasn't watching, but somebody who was said it was whoosh.
Yeah. So that, again, that's common when you have less resistance for the storm surge to come through. So if you have a pretty constrained inlet, then it has a lot of power to sort of dissipate. It resists. Surge will come in again. If you give it time, you have the same one. But the duration of the storm sort of matters as well. But in this case, with an open inlet down by the hook, then it's easier for a storm to come to bring in water. Now, what the waves would do, because your question was about waves as well, if you have southerly winds to accompany that storm, then you can grow larger waves. And what waves do, if you superimpose them with a surge, they can add and exacerbate the surge. So wind waves and swell waves with a storm can make the surge be worse. If I understand your question. So yeah, it is possible because I didn't draw a line here, but in the distance from up here to this part didn't change that much in the last 30 years. But the surge is going to be coming through here. So with this opening being larger, yeah, theoretically more surge and more water can come in during a storm. And also if you have, like I said, waves to accompany that surge, then the waves arriving at this coast and through this inlet are probably going to be larger, and they could be setting up, we call that wave setup. So did I answer your question?
You answered it very well. You didn't calm me down. I'm still anxious, but thank you.
All right, I can piggyback off of her question. My question is volume of water. Storm surge is one thing, but with the inlet widening, is that going to allow more volume through every day, every tide cycle? We're seeing the tide affected even on the very north end of the island. Now this winter, it's not been the high tides. We've had low tides, extra low tides. But what I'm wondering is if the volume of water is greater now because of the widening inlet.
I mean, if I were to, I know, I'm not gonna drink out of it, no. Gross. If I were to take this bottle and punch a little hole in it, a little pinhole, you get a volume of water coming out. If I take a pen and shove it through there, you can get a lot more water coming out a lot faster, right? So there's a friction effect here, which is effectively what this inlet's doing as well. In that, if you have a narrower inlet, everywhere that water's flowing, think of it, just kind of flowing down a channel there. Everywhere that water's touching the sand along the sides, that's slowing the water down. So here, this inlet is wider, which means there's less touching the sides. It's just as deep as it used to be. So you actually do have less friction slowing the water, which allows for more water to come in. That water's just being pulled just like by gravity in that thing. Water's being shoved out of that bottle. In this case, it's being pulled by the moon or by the sun, by the tides. So you have that volume of water coming in with a wider, we call cross-sectional area, larger cross-sectional area, you can get more water. It is not as extreme as it sounds though, because this area that used to be that spit, it's still, I don't need to tell you guys this, it's still pretty shallow out there, right? If you want to go in and out of the inlet, you still want to chase those channels.
It changes sometimes weekly.
Yeah. Those channels, though, are going to still take most of the flow.
Correct.
Because in the deep areas, So it doesn't matter if this went down another foot, if things open, it's still, most of it's going to go over here, but it has increased that opening, therefore can increase flooding in the back barriers behind them.
Can I add?
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead for it. Yeah.
Now, the second part of that question, it's not your job to tell us what to do, but what are your suggestions
Giannis.
to help us?
I got it.
I think Chris is done.
You're trapped, Chris. You're trapped. Can't get out
I
till
know
you
you,
answer
I know
that
you want to
question.
answer the first part, and then we could talk about it.
Well, I wanted to just add a quick comment to what Chris said. Well, you do have everything Chris said is correct, and maybe not the tide, but it's the wind tide. We'll call it wind tide. So if you have a wider inlet, even though the friction, is a little bit less, because wind has an additional effect that the tides don't have. Is that it could, you can have a storm that sits out there and blows, in the same direction for 3 days, right? And then with each tide, more water comes in, more water comes in, more water comes in. So a wider inlet has more of that effect. We call that high tide flooding, and that could continue to become worse, right? With a widening inlet.
So in terms of the other question about what to do, and if we zoom into the area, I'll just escape here. Let me just go back to a zoom in of this. Nope, go up to this one. It's okay. Maybe here. So you're on the edge of a channel there, right? This is part of the extra complication. This area here, you still have, remember Chincoteague Inlet, the main channels used to actually be down, it flowed through here, the water. If you go back not even 100 years, this was your main channel. A lot of this has started to shoal up through time. The sand, some of it probably what's coming in from Wallops, some of it from the old point, has started to shoal these channels. This has become, over time, more and more the dominant channel in this system. So you not only have all the fetch, you have this rapid flow. So as soon as you get hit with the wave and you have a current taking it, bam, it's going to move that sand away and help erode that area. Where it's not eroding, it's right there, right? Where you have the riprap is not necessarily in the same condition it was in when it first went in, but it is not eroding there. So, and we've got a big project working now with Wallops Island because they're looking at their shoreline erosion problem too. And, they actually make fun of me over there because I used to be like, no, let barrier islands do what they do. I still believe that in most cases. But sometimes you rock them up because you have to protect your infrastructure. You have to protect your houses, your community. And this is a place where I would be seriously considering, a heavy-duty riprap preventment, which is possibly not something that this town could go in and do on their own. And this is going to take some help from elsewhere to do the kind of riprap along this shore to stabilize this shoreline and help protect the market. It's one proven approach.
And I can add something really quick. I don't want to take up your time. Because the hook, right, and wallops are changing so quickly, the system is trying to adapt. That's what we think is happening. Because you asked us what we think as well, right? And monitoring comes into play here, perhaps more seriously than in any other occasions, because as the front part that we don't see on this image, the hook, wallops, and how water is being exchanged, and as Chris pointed out, that we know that you had a nice image from the 1912 actually up there earlier, and it's worth going back there if you can.
This one? That shows the 1912?
No, go one back. One more. Maybe one more. Right here. This is a good one. And I don't have the mic, so I'm going to... 'Cause- 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 Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is a really good image. There was also a 1912, Chris, but this is fine. So as Chris said before, here's the island.
I got you. Hang on.
You got me? Oh, there you go, right here. This is even better. I'm going to stand over here. I don't know if that's better or worse, but so this is the inlet right here. This is Wallops, and guess where the harbor is right now? Just guess without pointing. Just keep that thought in your. All right. Uh, now I have to figure out where it is. Okay. So the harbor. What, Chris, help me out here.
Basically, under the word and then the
it
sea.
it must
Back
be.
over here.
Is it somewhere up there? Okay. But I don't know if you remember, there were in the modern system, this is an island, right? And then there was another inlet that was cut through here. So as this pit was growing to the south, remember before I said that the water doesn't care. If the water was going through here, at some point, the speed grew, and then it shifted orientation. So instead of moving in and out like this, said, "Nah, that's too difficult. I'm gonna cut another channel through here." And I don't know if that person is in the audience, or maybe it was the harbor master, if I remember correctly. This is 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, 2019. And that person told me that he used to go fishing with someone in a little channel somewhere in between here. That little channel from 100 years ago is now what is the inlet that carries the majority of the tide that's right next to the harbor.
Come that one. Yeah.
There. So
Yeah. Right.
I had to say that.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
Good. I'm done.
Hi, thank you. I think the first kind of large-scale intervention process in these islands has been proposed by VIMS in the Cedar Island Resiliency Project, kind of working its way through permitting. And Dr. Hein's been really nice to kind of keep me very informed on the process. But basically what this project proposes is to dredge 90,000 cubic yards of Chincoteague Inlet to put on a thin stretch of the island that breached and closed in 2006. So my question is kind of twofold. For reference, 90,000 cubic yards is approximately 3.6 million 5-gallon buckets of material. So there has been some advising on what to do and reached into a project design and permit seeking. So my question is the width of Cedar Island, where this material is to be deposited, and have marsh building, which in theory would slow or deter a future breach. The need for the project was stated as this site will likely breach again and again. And I'd like to point that that part of the island is approximately 3.5 miles from two homes, which at the rate of 18 feet a year means the island would reach them in approximately 1,000 years. So my question is, if that island is 390 yards wide, but this stretch of Tom's Cove is 180 yards wide, why is that island more likely to breach and require intervention than a nearly half as wide stretch of island without vegetation? And then additionally,
You want to repeat all? No, I'm just kidding.
I'm familiar with the project down there, so yeah. There's a lot in there. First, we're here to talk about Chincoteague, what's going on here. We do have this very narrow isthmus here. One of the big differences between this area and the Cedar Island site is Chincoteague Inlet is massive. And it is draining all of Chincoteague Bay, and the water that's going through this very deep channel here is not going to turn, I don't have a good map of it up, and make that turn to go through this channel. I won't say, well, and I said that before, I cannot guarantee that this will never breach here. And I actually think that the kind of thing that's being proposed down there of building the island, and we'll go back to this map here, 1 second. This one, which shows, if you look at the 1912 shoreline here, this guy here, where the isthmus was 100 years ago, and now it's 3 or 4 times the width of the isthmus further in. You know, doing something to slow the migration of that isthmus, hold that sand in place, is an approach that, well, would be novel and risky in a place like this. Might work, might not work, but is an alternative approach if you had the interest in holding that in place. Tom's Cove is extremely shallow back there, and it hasn't breached yet in this place. That is in contrast to Cedar, which has breached and has been open for about 16 years in that exact location. This is open for, I don't know, you get a storm, it opens for a few days and it shuts down, maybe a few weeks at most, and then it shuts down. So it's a really, really different situation. This is not a sand-starved system. This has sand that is constantly coming, as shown by the growth of this spit. This is not a sand-starved system at all, unlike the islands to the south. So it's a really, really different scenario here. However, considering that in other places, having wide marsh behind an island helps stabilize that island, helps keep it in place, is a natural remedy to slowing island migration. What you have here is also a lot of leases right behind that area. So it's really complicated to try an approach like that in a place like this. But yeah. Yes, question over here.
Yes, thanks so much for this presentation. It's really been very educational. Yeah. I had a question, and I know it's totally different and on the West Coast, but I read an article about North Cove, Washington. Small town, very much like Chincoteague.
Okay.
Went through the very exact same situation. And they did their research and found using basalt cobbles as a berm was taking care of the situation of that erosion, because that specific type of rock actually holds the sand in. When the waves start bringing that in, it holds the sand and then redevelops that area and even brings back ecosystems that they had lost due to the erosion.
I've not heard of this approach before.
It happened in 2016, so they're 10 years into, and they said it resolved their issue.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with basalt, and I'll say, well, I would say that Cedar is a different situation. Obviously, so is the West Coast at a faster rate. The land is rising at a faster rate, so sea level's actually about stable. I don't know that solution. I apologize that I've not heard of that one before. We're just north of Willapa Bay. I know Giannis is just checking it out.
I'm looking at the map.
It's not a place I'm familiar with. I might ask you, because I'm going to forget, I might ask you to write that one down so I can check it out and learn more. Again, we're in the game of understanding the challenges and hoping to provide the information for both the Corps and the town to look into solutions. That should maybe be on their radar as well. I'm just not familiar with that particular approach. And Giannis, you haven't heard of it either?
No, I haven't heard of it. I would be interested to get more detail, but I'm looking at the map here, and maybe we need to talk to you later about what is the similarity to this area. I am familiar with Willapa Bay and what goes on there, but as Chris said, it's a different system, so there might be some similarities, there might be some differences, but thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
I unfortunately, I don't have much to say about it, except thank you for bringing it up. And if that solution is indeed within the realm of this system, then that solution should be considered, for sure.
All right, just a quick question. The currents that are coming down out of Nova Scotia as they run down, say, through New York and Jersey and then hit Ocean City where it surges in and out. As it comes down, that coastline, we'd gotten hit by Sandy, had a microburst, took out a few trees. But if it continues on down and the currents surge via fetch or whatever from a hurricane, does the model show what damages could happen to that hook and the rest of the island?
Which area is that?
I'm not.
You tell us what happened, you mean in terms of flooding or in terms of erosion? Sorry,
Yeah.
There was some erosion, but there was a lot of flooding.
Yeah.
And when it had the microburst, it would snap a lot of the pine trees over by Piney Island just through that one section. But if we were to get hit from a hurricane coming up out of Florida, does the model show what damages could be done to that hook, that inlet, or anywhere along that shoreline?
Right. So basically, what's the biggest storm we hit this thing with in the model?
Okay.
And, yeah, because I understand. Yep.
The models can handle storms. We do that all the time, whether it is flooding or where the sediment goes during storm. That's within the capability. And the situation you're describing is basically a microburst that knocked down trees or snapped trees. What that would do is reduce the wind sheltering. So now if you open up an area from trees, then that wind can transfer more energy into the water and maybe even exacerbate the flooding as well. Unfortunately, the model cannot change the trees during the storm. They move sediment during the storm, but we have to tell it what the land use is. Like, hey, we have homes here, we have parking lots here, and we have trees here. But with some development, that's a possibility. So I guess partially to answer your question, yes, those scenarios could be investigated. There are atmospheric models that capture those microbursts, and given the right resolution, models should theoretically pick them up if that is the focus. We haven't looked at that here, but my answer is that that's something that could be looked at.
So you said that 3,000 years ago, the sand was depositing because of waves to build Chincoteague, right? Why are waves now causing erosion? What determines whether waves build land or remove land?
Okay. Right. So 3,000 years ago, causing. So it's really to do with the direction that the waves are striking the coast and moving sediment along the coast. In the same way that if you look at wallops, and maybe this diagram shows it. I don't know if I zoomed out enough on it, unfortunately. Yeah, this will show it. This will show it. Where, forget about this for a minute. Just look at wallops and how it's growing over time like that. So, waves indeed, they pick up sand, they deposit sand, they move it around, right? And it just is a matter of the energy, the direction that they're moving. So two things are happening here. You have waves maybe coming out of the south that are driving sand along this part of the beach and bringing it up here, and it is allowing that to grow and build. I'll get back to Chincoteague in a minute, don't worry. Allowing it to grow and build. The other thing that's happening is you have some ripping currents coming along in, well, I'll wait till it's there, but the channel that runs along here that also brings sand. You also have sand that's coming across from Fishing Point, from the hook, going across the inlet and adding to that. So you have three different places. You have sand being driven by waves, sand being driven by waves, sand being driven by currents, during storms, during non-storms. And then it gets to the inlet and it meets, complex currents, and that sand gets dropped out. It stops moving along the shore. Some of it actually does make it all the way along here. But over time, when you look at this over decades, you have the beach continuously grow out because it's a lower energy environment. It's kind of the sand coming from all directions into one point at once, coming across here, up here, and feeding that area. And that's where it's dropping out. And each one of these is basically, you can see the thinner lines there, right? Those are old beaches. Literally, you could see the exact same thing on Chincoteague Island. So you have to go back in time in your mind to when it looked like. And as Assateague grew, that depot center shifted and the whole thing grew out wider. Now those waves are coming in. It's hitting marsh, which is more sensitive, right? It's doesn't hold as well as well, sand can move, but it is fairly easily eroded. And it is no longer it's still open to the south like that, directly pointing to it. This is more of an alongshore problem. It's kind of like when you're at the beach and you get picked up by waves and you get moved, you get out of the water and your blanket's like, 100 yards up. It's like that. That's what's happening to the sand, grain by grain here, in that longshore current being pulled alongshore and deposited. This is more a day when their waves aren't coming and you're just standing there in the surf zone getting whacked. Right? So it's a bit more of a easy process being moved alongshore and deposited in a lower energy. This is the waves coming in and smacking it. And that's how Chincoteague formed, in the same way that Wallops has grown.
Just a little follow-up. If you happen to have a hurricane that went right through that arrow and up around that hook.
Oh, man. All right.
What are the damages with the water current and ETC?
Yep. I mean, that's the kind of thing where that would be, look, if we had a direct hit here, all bets are off. I won't say that, we can't say anything about it. Will largely, so it'll get flooded, it'll get run over. Probably some of the ridges, the dune ridges could get flattened. If it's a good enough hit and it actually runs sand right over it, it'll probably get washed back a little bit. But this will survive. At the end of the day, still a deep inlet, but it could cause a more permanent breach there. At that, something like a direct hit like that is a different game. Let's just hope that doesn't happen. I certainly do. Yeah.
So, you talked about the possibility of, depositing dredge material along the isthmus. And I think I know the answer to this, but would there be any sense to actually depositing dredge material on the point to
on
try
the point
to
itself?
extend that point back?
Yeah, where it's eroding. So the problem with it is you need something like that with that high energy environment coming through the inlet. You need something to hold it in place. It's the kind of place where rocks are what will not move in large waves. Where dredge material, you need structure. You need structure.
We have one or two more questions.
You all good?
Good?
I'm fine.
One or two more?
I'm good.
If you look at an aerial photograph of the Ocean City Inlet, and you see the jetty coming out, and this great big wide beach is to the north of it. And when you look at Assateague, it's going away.
Yep.
All right, so is all that sand supposed to be on this end? Is that why we're losing our beaches?
So a lot of it's nourished. So Ocean City, they are artificially going offshore, dredging sand off the bottom and bringing it onto the beach to widen the beach. Those jetties then, as you are indicating, do trap sand, right? So sand coming along shore hits that jetty, can't go further. Some of it is bypassing that, we call it inlet bypassing, is bypassing that jetty and reaching the next beach and continuing south. But so much of it just kind of misses that very northern pit of Assateague and just keeps on going. So that is a relatively sand-starved chunk just in the first maybe half mile there south of the jetty.
Yeah, well, when we first built the bridge over here, we had about, I'd say 300 more yards of beach than we have now. And then, where's all that sand gone? Also, I worked at Wallops for 41 years. I was on Wallops Island. And I watched them bring in all that sand, when they dredged from offshore.
Yep. Where'd you go?
They made a beautiful beach. I watched them do it. Those guys knew what they were doing.
Yep. It's gone.
1 year it was gone.
It's gone. Yep. Yeah, in fact, they did it right before Hurricane Sandy, and it was
Yep.
gone not even a year later.
1 year it was
Yep.
gone.
Yep, that's right. And again, it's the same forces that drive sand, like I was saying, yourself in the waves of the beach, that drive sand along shore. The other thing, though, is that some of it gets pulled offshore into deeper water with erosion. Typically, you think about this, so you've probably seen this. You go to the beach, maybe on a nice summer day after there's been some storms, and these bars start moving on shore. You walk out into the waves, and then you pop back up, and you're on shallow water, and then you walk back out again. Sand does move offshore, get eroded, and then come back. But all along the way, it's being pulled to the sides. And wallops, that happens to be pulled from central wallops, pushed to the north by waves, and from central wallops to the south. And right in the middle, where it's being pulled away in both directions, $1 billion of infrastructure, of launch pads. The same thing's happening everywhere. That same process driving sediment is what's moving it from Delaware all the way down the coast to Ocean City. And it's doing well. Some of it is natural trapping of sand, unnatural trapping of sand by those jetties, by those structures, the northern jetty in particular. But some of that, they do have to nourish that beach. They do it every, I forget how many years, but they do it every so many years, fewer than 10, to nourish that beach and keep it water. Is that trapping sand? Yes, naturally, but they're also nourishing it so much that it almost equals out. Because they wouldn't nourish it they wouldn't spend the money if they didn't have to, if it wasn't eroding. So in net, again, I think it's really small impact down here of those jetties. Interesting point of fact, that inlet is not it's a natural one. It opened up naturally in a storm. There you go. But it wasn't there before. And there's actually a history along Chincoteague Island of there being inlets that were open for several decades and closed. And when they did so, when an inlet's open, sand goes into that inlet, deposits in the back down these islands. So if an inlet opened up on Chincoteague somewhere, that might slow the delivery of sand down here because sand's getting pushed into that back barrier to form what we call a flood tidal delta. That is not something that's happening now, but has in the 1800s. There were 2 other inlets open along. You could see them in the historical maps. Again, it's not really happening at Ocean City because they also then dredge that and pull that sand out. Yeah.
So I think one of the other big things here, we've already asked, what do we do? And we can't predict that. But if the other question is, how much time do we have? Does the historical data show an acceleration in the rate of change that's predictable?
Like the fishing point is growing, the hook is growing faster than it was. Although it's also narrowed quite a bit. It takes a lot more sand to build a ridge that long than one that long. So it is growing to the south faster than it was. You look in the scientific literature and there's, papers that there's been a debate about this among scientists, depending on how you look at the data about whether storms are getting more frequent, more intense, whether nor'easters are getting stronger. Signs are that in general, that is true and they're moving further north, or the bigger storms are moving further north along the coast. And storms are dominantly what moves sediment. A single storm can move a lot more sediment than weeks of non-storm conditions. So in theory, yeah, I would say things are speeding up here. I think that that's an accurate statement. It does appear that with the inlet now open for 20 years, more open than it was, wider than it was, you are absolutely losing, marsh here. And, you can even just look at those images, the 2011 to 2024, you've lost a lot more than you had in maybe the first 6 years. So we could look at the rates of change. We haven't done that. But honestly, it's a different conversation, but a serious one. The fact that water levels are rising, the idea was brought up earlier that you have this challenge at the parks where maybe it's during storms you have more water coming in, but just on the day-to-day, you probably notice a few more days during the year than you did 5 or 10 years ago that the road from here to the harbor is flooded, that the water's getting awfully close to the causeway, that the saltwater levels are rising under the island. To me, as I look at Chincoteague, having studied this since about 2019, it's not that long, but spent a good 5-6 years really thinking about this area and punching a lot of holes in this island. Thank you. I really think that is the threat, that when you say, how long do we have on Chincoteague, that's the bigger threat. Yes, you want this marsh here. It protects the harbor, it protects Chincoteague, and having this here means that less water is getting into Chincoteague. Don't get me wrong about that. But I still think that longer term, thinking like as a geologist would of decades here, it's really low lying, and you don't need me to tell you that.
Should we get buried on the mainland?
Jonas, that's a question for you, sir. Thank you, Jonas. It depends if you want to be floating away in another 30 years after.
All right, one more.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you first off for giving us this opportunity to get someone here of your caliber who's done this study just in this local area is really fantastic for us here on the island. I have a question, and there's been some questions all around this tonight. How long and how much and this. And it's not really your field. I'm sure that you probably discussed this, but I'm sure you did not put anything like this on paper while you were doing the study, but you work in this field, you know folks in this field, and I'm going to ask you straight up, assuming that your model does not indicate that this problem will solve itself with the wider inlet and a greater amount of water coming in and the greater erosion, then I will ask you, the solution to this problem seems to me it's going to be very expensive. Is that a fair statement?
I think it is. I think
Thank
that's
you.
Yeah.
So being a rural and small community, we are going to be asking a lot of folks for a lot of help here, and this will lend a lot of credibility to those asks, and I really appreciate you coming here, and I just wanted to make that statement, that's all.
And I've said this before to you, Mike, and we were asked to help with the town. The Commonwealth came to us. We're part of the team. Whatever our model and whatever our data, whatever we can do to help support that, we're here. We want to be helpful there at the level that we're able to. Again, it's not an engineering model. We don't have the power of the Corps behind us, but we want to be as helpful as we can. So please reach out with questions from the town. If we could, something we could run and something we could do, that's what we're here for.
Thank you. Council comments? No? Good?
Thank you.
Thank you both. Very informative, great presentation, exactly what we needed people to hear. So the last bit of business for us, stay warm, all that good stuff. I'm going to be buried on Chincoteague. I don't know where you're going. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going anywhere.
I need a motion from my council to adjourn. I got a motion and a second to adjourn tonight's meeting. Thank you all very much. Have a good night.